Welcome to this year's Global Threat Brief that we do here at the RSA Conference. I'm so pleased to do this talk this year jointly with Sandra Joyce, who runs threat intelligence for FireEye, to give a broader industry perspective on the latest in the cyber threat landscape. So welcome, Sandra.
Thank you for having me.
And Sandra, 2020 was certainly a challenging year in so many respects. We had the global pandemic. We've seen cyber adversaries of all types take advantage of the stress and the workload that is brought onto the defenders. But also, we've had the elections and the cyber interference that we all expected that somewhat has not necessarily materialized in those times. But before we drill into the go around the world threat brief, let's talk about two major events of the last few months: SolarWinds and the Exchange Hafnium hacks. Two operations that are both very similar in nature in terms of their initial objectives, but also vastly different in scope and behavior of the adversary. So let's begin with SolarWinds, or Holiday Bear operations, I call it.
And 2452, that is.
Holiday Bear, since we now know it has certainly impacted more than just SolarWinds itself. So from my perspective, Sandra, this was a traditional espionage operation. We now know it was orchestrated by the SVR, Russian intelligence services, and the targets were the targets that you expect the Russians to go after. Foreign governments, particularly US governments, Department of Treasury, we know was hit, Department of Homeland Security, Justice Department, and other companies that would be used to facilitate access to those government networks.
Right, and when you think about an espionage operation, it's very interesting to see what was targeted and what wasn't. And clearly, it was an espionage based on what wasn't targeted. Financial information, PII. There wasn't a dump of information that we've seen. So all of that really points to the idea that this was an operation to satisfy national level collection requirements, and that's espionage.
And the most interesting thing for me, Sandra, is what you guys actually published in your blog post back in December when you analyzed the malware, is that it had a kill switch in it. Mm-hmm. And the Russians actually used that kill switch to terminate their access permanently, shut down the malware in 99% of the victims. The victims they didn't care about, including companies I've seen that they have targeted in the past, so clearly had an espionage objective but they decided to focus their efforts on the most high-value targets, obviously not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they wanted to keep this operation in stealth mode as long as possible. And in some ways, what they're doing here is emulating what they've traditionally been doing for almost 100 years in human intelligence, where we all remember the illegals operations where they send out people under covert cover, under fake names to live in countries like the United States and Europe for long periods of time so that they can get close to people in power and collect information. It seems to me that this operation in many ways mimics what they're trying to do in human. Get inside those networks through supply chains that are hard to detect and stay in there for long periods of time.
In a way, it's a real modernization of very classic techniques. But now with cyber as an instrument of national power, that's the method that they're going to as a plan A instead of a plan B or C.
Now let's contrast that with the Exchange Hafnium hacks from China. It started out in a very traditional way. They found some vulnerabilities. They used those vulnerabilities in exchange to get access to mail servers of their traditional targets. Obviously, think tanks, dissident groups, Uyghurs, the types of people that we expect the Chinese intelligence services to go after. But then they did something unprecedented. They went after literally everyone once they learned that Microsoft was going to patch these vulnerabilities. Have you ever seen them do this?
No, it's incredibly aggressive, and it also has the secondary effect of, when they drop these web shells, they leave so much vulnerable. So organizations that cannot mitigate, can't patch, they really are, it's open season on them for follow-on attacks by other APT groups. But even, more disconcerting would be a ransomware operator who now has access to these organizations.
That's exactly right, Sandra. The fact that they use these web shells with very basic passwords, sometimes just default passwords, that would allow virtually anyone that could scan for those web shells to gain access to those networks, even if they've been patched, is what makes this even more reckless, because you're not just targeting people that you have no business targeting, but you also leave them vulnerable, as you said, to ransomware operatives and others that can do real damage inside those networks. And it's amazing to see this contrast where Russia is the more responsible actor in this particular case, when traditionally it's been China that has never used destructive attacks in the past. And obviously in this particular case, it wasn't destruction, but the reckless nature of this is quite unprecedented.
Agreed.
Now let's switch gears and actually start talking broadly about China. They of course, have been focusing a lot on the pandemic and biotech as a target for espionage, but what else have they been up to?
If you look at China's strategic plan, you can really see the areas that they're interested in. And healthcare and biotech have long been on that list. With the backdrop of the global pandemic, what we saw were Chinese threat actors who were going after vaccine developers, researchers, trying to get a picture, trying to collect information that could help them in battling, not only battling the virus itself, but also understanding the decision-making process of countries around the world. And interestingly, they weren't just the only the perpetrator in this. They were also the victim of some of this. So a Vietnamese APT group that we observed had actually targeted the Wuhan regional government looking for information on COVID-19. So this is one of those cases where China was the aggressor and also the victim.
Well, I imagine every intelligence service was trying to figure out back in January of 2020 what was going on exactly in Wuhan, and they had good reasons to.
Right.
So what else has China been up to?
Well, what we're seeing also is, one of the things that we're not seeing is probably even more interesting. We're not seeing a lot of destructive or disruptive capability coming out of China. And when you look at their peers, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, who willingly and frequently use destructive or disruptive operation, China hasn't done that. They're using that in reserve. And when we think about their long-term plan and how that fits into it, we start to see a picture emerge.
One of the most interesting things has been that the PLA, that probably would have the authority to execute destructive attacks in China, has been really taking a back seat for many years now to the Ministry of State Security, their civilian intelligence agency, really since 2015 Obama-Xi agreement, when we saw the PLA activity just plummet across the board in cyberspace. But they're really starting to reemerge. We saw them in the Equifax hack. We're starting to see them in some of the later operations that are being conducted. So this is quite a worrisome sign.
It's also very characteristic, though, of Chinese operations. Though in the past, when we've seen them become publicly exposed, like APT-10, for example, we then see them go into some kind of hibernation and retooling. And when we think about the reorganization of the PLA and the MSS, they're doing the same type of thing. A very quiet retooling and reorganization. And what's emerged is a much more focused and disciplined operation.
And speaking of retooling, we've really seen them go after mobile devices, which is not an easy task by any means, right? And particularly targeting with of Uyghurs and other dissident groups within China. They've really stepped up their game there.
They're using cyber means in order to perpetrate their political ends. And when we think about dissident groups and groups that are running contrary to the Communist Party, we see an aggressive behavior from Chinese threat actors. And that's just not going to stop. That's going to continue into the future.
All right, next up, Iran. We really started the year in 2020 being worried about retribution for the Soleimani operation conducted by the Trump administration, but it really hasn't occurred. Obviously, there was a kinetic response shortly thereafter, but in cyberspace, they really held back for most of 2020 against the United States. What do you make of that?
I really think that sometimes in the cybersecurity industry, we tend to think of quid pro quo as having to stay in the cyber domain. But there are lots of ways that organizations and nation states can actually exercise power. It doesn't have to stay in the cyber domain. So we could see a cyber action being followed on by diplomatic sanctions or kinetic military action. It's really about a government perpetuating their own national security needs, using whatever tools they have at their disposal.
But we did see them interfere in the elections in an even more aggressive way than the Russians did in cyberspace with the Proud Boys emails. Can you talk about that?
That was a big surprise to us because everybody really was focused on Russia. And that, as you said, didn't materialize. But what we saw was a real evolution in the use of information operations where they used cultural elements, excellent taste in music. They used Metallica to back up their video. And, really what this email was supposed to do was it was targeted to voters, trying to intimidate them. And we saw, and as a result of that, it really changed our thinking into what the Iranian government was willing to carry out. And they ended up being the primary way that we saw election interference happening.
One of the other things that they're doing that's really innovative is leveraging social networks like LinkedIn to identify people within companies that they can target, particularly for espionage purposes. That's one of the major ways that they're now getting inside their organizations, isn't it?
That's right. They're taking a page right out of the Russian playbook on this one. And then we've been seeing them do this for a while. A group that we call Newscaster was actually doing this several years ago. So this is a tried and true technique that we're seeing where Iran is doing the network analysis that they need to do to find key individuals or to propagate some very effective narrative that they want to see amplified. That's classic information operations, and we're seeing Iran really embrace that.
And also DNS hijacking is coming back. They did this years ago. They famously compromised certificate authorities to facilitate those operations within Iran. But now we're seeing more and more of that.
We're seeing more of that, and we're seeing a really clear distinction between their regional plan and that international plan that Iran has. So what they're also targeting regionally, groups like APT-33 are using Shamoon and other wipers to target businesses throughout the Middle East, and they continue to conduct espionage in the United States and elsewhere. So they really have a plan, and their sophistication continues to grow.
So they remain very focused on using that power regionally, but still staying away from the United States, except in espionage cases.
For now.
In North Korea, they're in some ways my favorite actor in cyberspace because they're just so incredibly innovative. If you think about it, they've come up with some of the most innovative attacks we've seen yet. In fact, we just talked about destructive attacks. North Koreans have really pioneered that back in the early 2000s when they went hard after South Korea with destructive attacks. And of course, they did Sony. And with Sony, they really pioneered another model that the Russians then took on, which is the hack and leak capability, where they hacked into Sony and leaked their emails. And then, of course, from a cybercrime perspective, they're incredibly audacious in going after the banking sector and cryptocurrency exchanges.
They're one of the first threat actors that's nation state sponsors to cross over into cybercrime to fund the government. Groups like APT-38, we watched them conduct bank heists around the world. They were targeting at one point 16 different financial organizations at once. And this is after a long history of being able to pivot from regional focus like APT-37, trying to conduct espionage operations on the peninsula, and then expanding to a more international operation. So we're watching North Korea do a lot of evolution and a lot of, again, sophistication in their techniques, and a lot of it's homegrown.
That's the most fascinating thing about their operations. If you think about what the Russians are now doing, what the Chinese are doing, the Iranians, they're leveraging common tools like Cobalt Strike. They still have some of their own capabilities as well, but more and more they're leveraging off-the-shelf tools. One, because you don't need to spend efforts creating it, and two, it's even better if you're trying to avoid being attributed, because it's much harder to attribute a common commodity tool like that. But the North Koreans have really shied away from that. They're still focused on custom development, and almost, you can call it Juche malware, where Juche, of course, is their core themes in North Korea for self-sustainment, and that their economy needs to be completely independent of the West. But they seem to be taking the same tack in cyberspace.
And their innovation doesn't stop there. They're actually targeting cryptocurrencies, developing their own cryptocurrencies, and targeting vulnerability researchers to target the applications that they're developing.
And by the way, we're all rightly concerned about supply chain hacks post SolarWinds, but the North Koreans have been pioneers there as well. They've targeted AV vendors, they've targeted even cryptocurrency software to insert backdoors into their applications. So just incredible level of sophistication that we're seeing from North Koreans. If you face them on your networks, you really need to bring your A game.
That's right.
And of course, no threat brief can be complete without a discussion of Russia. Election hacking really did not materialize in a significant way in 2020, but we still saw some major activities that's quite disturbing from Russia, aside from SolarWinds in 2020.
Yeah, we saw them target a wealth of VPN exploits, and also with the SolarWinds activity, we saw the golden SAML technique being used, which allowed them to mint their own tokens and then have access to multiple applications within the same federated environment. Some of these innovations also led to real obfuscation and OPSEC, really stealthy techniques. They would name their own infrastructure after their target infrastructure, so you couldn't tell the difference. They would also use IP addresses that were in the United States to complicate the investigation efforts. It's a lot harder to investigate U.S. infrastructure when you're an intelligence organization that doesn't have access or jurisdiction in that area.
That's right. And of course, their interest in the cloud has been long-standing. They've been targeting cloud providers for many, many years, but they're taking this up a notch now, and particularly with the Goldman SAML attacks, targeting authentication systems, targeting identity systems. That makes it super hard for defenders to actually do incident response, because if the actor is using legitimate credentials of a real employee inside the network, it's so difficult to figure out if the action that you're looking at was done by a legitimate user within the network or if it was done by the adversary.
And it doesn't matter if a user is changing their password or using multi-factor. None of that matters. The threat actor is going to maintain access.
But also, one of the big concerning points from Russia that we saw last year was targeting of critical infrastructure. We often think about critical infrastructure as energy or water, but transportation is a huge factor here as well, and they went pretty hard after it, didn't it?
Right. In a group that we've tracked for years called Temp Isotope, we saw them having huge interest in airports specifically. And when you think about the threats against critical infrastructure, they really underpin not just the economy, not just the daily life of organizations and people, but they also underpin the confidence in those critical systems for people themselves in their own government. So critical infrastructure as a target has multiple effects, not just the systems themselves, but instilling fear in people.
So we've talked a lot about the nation states, the four primary nation state adversaries that we face in cyberspace. But to me, the biggest threat is actually not the nation states. It's ransomware. It's impacting everyone under the planet, from your grandmother that now has to find Bitcoins to unlock her family photos, to small organizations, school districts and the like, and hospitals, to the largest companies. And now they're moving towards extortion. They're
using extortion in really shaming ways. So they'll threaten to dump data that they've found. They'll even call competitors. They'll call your customers. They want to make sure they can use shame as a tool. And that puts organizations in an impossible situation. If they decide to pay the ransom, they could also be risking paying out an OFAC country in violation of sanctions laws. So not only are they taking these steps, but they're also targeting hospitals, something that's really crossing the line when it comes to humanity, and especially during a global pandemic.
That's right. But the ransom payments themselves are going up astronomically. They're now in the tens of millions of dollars, aren't they?
We saw an extortion attempt for $50 million recently. And that's, if you think back just a few years, it was a few hundred Bitcoin when Bitcoin was worth a lot less. And now we're talking about $50 million. We've seen 10, 20, 30. This is just getting out of hand.
Absolutely. And now they're becoming so aggressive on the extortion demands, they're even reaching out to journalists to give them a heads up to put further pressure on the company. I mean, it's almost like ransomware is now just a side business to the overall extortion business.
That's right. And it puts these organizations in a position where even law enforcement can't touch the threat actors who are sitting on the other side of the world, being protected by governments who are just turning a blind eye.
Yes, and the reality is most of these operations, in terms of the hardcore criminals that are developing the malware, developing the capabilities, are in Russia, right, or Russian speaking, and many of them are being hidden or in some cases assisted even by the Russian intelligence service. In some cases, we know they actually work for Russian intelligence by day, executing operations for the state purpose, and then by night moonlighting, conducting cybercrime operations. So in many ways, I coined this phrase over half a decade ago: we don't have a cyber problem, we have a Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea problem. It applies to cybercrime as much as it does to nation states. So let's talk about the future. What's coming up here? Well, we have the Olympics coming up just in a little bit over a month from now. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, the Olympics is this very highly visible political event. It has been a target of threat actors in the past, and we fully anticipate the Tokyo Olympics having the same situation. The Olympics provide threat actors the ability to send a message and to do it at scale.
And when it comes to ransomware, we expect that they will continue to evolve, both in terms of their business model, but also in terms of sophistication, right? I mean, we have not yet seen ransomware really go after firmware and try to physically destroy hardware, but that can absolutely be on the horizon. We know that technically that capability exists. What else do you think is going to happen there?
Well, as you mentioned before, really this departure from ransomware altogether and straight to extortion. There is a path for threat actors who can just, without even breaching an organization, can still conduct extortion operations. And that is very lucrative and could possibly be the next steps that we see.
The other key trend that's really fascinating is the growing expertise that China has developed in the zero-day development game. And you've seen this both on the research side with the Pwn2Owns that they're increasingly winning and have been for years, but also in their use of 0 days. You guys have just highlighted that in the network gear space with PulseSecure and the SonicWall appliances. We've seen that obviously on the exchange side, but you're really starting to see China emerging as one of the top users of 0 days going forward.
And what's interesting to me is the audacity and the reduction of OPSEC, because what we're seeing is they don't care if they get discovered. The widespread targeting, a lot of this is happening in broad daylight, and it seems to us that they really are trying to send a message. They don't care if they're caught. They're making a statement, and they're saying that they are going to be able to do this and perhaps testing the new administration.
And of course, if you want to develop 0 days, one of the best ways you can do that is by targeting security researchers. We've seen North Korea do this lately. We've seen China do this in the past as well. And the security industry is really becoming a top target for every single actor.
As if the security researchers didn't have enough on their plate as it is, now they have to worry about being personally targeted for the information that they're personally working on that probably doesn't have the security setup that maybe an enterprise company does. It's a shortcut to a lot of great information.
And let's face it, unfortunately, there's a lot of double talk in our industry, and people that should be practicing better security, that know better, are not doing what's needed. So the other trend that I think is really interesting is how all of these actors, the nation states in particular, are really becoming shameless in my view. We've talked a lot for many years now about the need to name and shame actors and publicly attribute them, which I think is still very, very important, but they're really becoming immune to that. And it's interesting that they're not even changing their TTPs much when they're being called out anymore. One example of that is China Chopper. I mean, the Chinese have been using it for so long, and it's just a one-line web shell. For God's sakes, change it up a bit and make it a little bit more interesting. But and obviously, China is not the only party that's using it, but it's just such a telltale sign when you see it. It's amazing that they don't change up their tools that often.
When you see something like the complete disregard for operational security, at that point, you either have a threat actor who is not afraid of the consequences or is trying to send a message, or both. And I think that's what's happening here.
That's right. And finally, the last point I want to make is that the threat environment is becoming the worst it's ever been, not just because of all the technical reasons we've talked about, but from a geopolitical perspective. The four primary adversaries we face, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, our relationship with them from the Western standpoint is the worst it's been probably in at least 60 years. Most of these countries have stopped caring about a good relationship with the United States. They're much less dependent on us, in part through sanctions activities that we've done against them. And as a result, they're becoming more and more reckless. And I really fear for what's to come with the growing sophistication of these adversaries, and also their willingness to push us further and further because they don't fear the consequences.
Cyber continues to be a tool of national power, and it provides an asymmetric capability for countries that don't have the military might or don't have the economic power. And as they grow in influence and they grow in capability, they just continue to do these things without fear of any type of retribution.
Well, thank you so much. This is Dmitry Alperovich.
And Sandra Joyce.
And thanks for joining us for the Global Threat Brief at the RSA Conference.